The morning Roy Shepard rode into Caldwell, Kansas with a warrant in his breast pocket and a dead man's testimony burning a hole in his conscience. He had no idea that the woman he had come to destroy would be the one to save him instead. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail like a wound that refused to heal, a cattle town strung together with raw lumber, broken promises, and the kind of ambition that smelled like gunpowder and whiskey. The main street was wide enough to turn a full cattle drive, and on most mornings it was thick with drovers, merchants, and the particular brand of lawlessness that gathered wherever money and desperation shared a fence line. Roy had been a lawman for 11 years, the last 4 of them spent wearing the badge of Sumner County Sheriff, and he knew this stretch of Kansas better than he knew his own reflection. He knew the saloons that were fronts for gambling rings and the church deacons who ran them. He knew which judges took bribes and which ones only took whiskey. He knew the land, the wind, the people. What he did not know yet was Harriet Holloway. He had her name written in a file that Judge Clarence Beaumont had pressed into his hands 3 weeks earlier in Wichita. The file was thin, just 4 pages, but what those pages contained was enough to make Roy's jaw tighten when he read them the first time, and tighten harder every time after. Harriet Holloway, widow of Calvin Holloway, was accused of forging land deeds for a full 40-acre parcel that bordered the southern edge of town. The land in question had once belonged to a railroad man named Edmund Graves, and Graves wanted it back. He had the ear of Judge Beaumont, and Judge Beaumont had the ear of the territorial governor, and together those 3 men had decided that Roy Shepard, with his clean record and his unimpeachable reputation, was the right man to ride down to Caldwell and gather testimony against a widow woman who was sitting on land that powerful men had decided they needed. Roy had done what he was told, because he was a man who believed in the law, who had bled for it more than once, who had buried a deputy and carried the weight of that loss as a reminder of what the absence of order looked like. He rode south from Wichita with the file and a packet of signed witness depositions, each one compiled by Graves's personal attorney, each one pointing a finger squarely at Harriet Holloway. He arrived on a Tuesday, checked into the Merchant's Hotel on Main Street, and asked the desk clerk where he might find the Holloway property. The clerk, a young man with a patchy mustache and the nervous energy of someone who knew more than he was saying, gave Roy a long look before he answered. "Out on the South Road, Sheriff, about 2 miles past the water tower. You will know the place because there are sunflowers along the fence line." She planted them herself the first spring after her husband passed. Roy thanked him, took his room key, and that evening he walked the town instead of riding out immediately. He wanted to get a feel for Caldwell before he made his move, before he knocked on Harriet Holloway's door with a warrant in hand. He stopped in the general store, where a broad-shouldered man named Deke Harmon sold him tobacco, and without being asked, launched into an unprompted defense of a woman Roy had not yet mentioned. "You the sheriff from Wichita?" Harmon asked. Roy said he was. "Then I expect you are here about Harriet. I will tell you right now, before you get the wrong idea from the wrong people, that woman has never forged a single paper in her life. Calvin Holloway bought that land fair, and everybody in Caldwell knows it. Everybody except the ones with money enough to rewrite the story." Roy kept his expression neutral, the way he had trained himself to do over 11 years. "I appreciate the sentiment," he said, and left it there. He ate supper at a place called the Dusty Rose, which served decent beef stew and terrible coffee, and sat at a corner table where he could watch the room. The place was full by 7 in the evening, all the tables occupied by men who smelled of cattle and dust and the long trail north, and Roy listened to their conversations with the practiced ear of a man who had spent a decade reading Rooms for Danger. He heard Harriet Holloway's name twice before his coffee cup was empty. Both times it was spoken with the same protective warmth that Harmon had shown, as if she were not a suspect but a landmark, something that belonged to Caldwell the way the water tower and the grain elevator belonged to it. He rode out the next morning. The South Road was exactly as the clerk had described it, a rutted track that wound between fields of dry grass and new spring growth, and he saw the sunflowers from a quarter-mile away. They were not in bloom yet, just tall green stems with their faces still tight and pale, but there were hundreds of them, lining both sides of the fence as far as he could see, and for a moment they stopped him cold. There was something in the sight of all that deliberate beauty, all that careful planting along a boundary line, that felt like a statement he could not quite interpret. The house was a solid two-story structure, built from good Kansas timber and properly chinked, with a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning light. Behind it he could see a barn in good repair and a kitchen garden that had been turned recently, the black soil still dark with moisture. A dog, a big brindle shepherd mix, came off the porch at a run, and then stopped at the fence to bark twice before sitting down and wagging its tail, which Roy had always considered the best possible summary of how most dogs felt about strangers. He dismounted and tied his horse to the post, and he was reaching for the gate when the front door opened and Harriet Holloway came out onto the porch. He recognized her from nothing, because there had been no description in the file, only her name and the accusations. What he saw was a woman of perhaps 29 or 30, tall and straight-backed, wearing a plain gray work dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that looked like it had seen a great deal of weather. She was carrying a basket on one arm, and she stopped when she saw him, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other across the fence and the garden path and the spring morning. "You are the sheriff," she said. It was not a question. "Roy Shepard," he said, "out of Sumner County. I know who you are." She set the basket down on the porch railing and came down the steps without any hurry, walking toward him with the measured stride of someone who had decided not to run from something difficult. "I have been expecting someone like you for about 6 weeks now. Come in. I will make coffee." He followed her inside, which he had not expected to do quite so easily, and found himself in a kitchen that was clean and well-ordered, with copper pots on their hooks and a long table that bore the evidence of recent baking, flour still in the seams of the wood. She poured water into the coffee pot from a pitcher and set it on the iron stove with the efficiency of someone who had performed the action 10,000 times. "I should be direct with you," Roy said, taking the chair she gestured toward. "Please do," Harriet said, and sat across from him with her hands folded on the table, meeting his eyes with a directness that he found immediately unsettling, not because it was hostile but because it was perfectly calm. He had expected fear, or at least nervousness. He had expected the behavior of a guilty person caught. What he got instead was a woman who looked like she had already made her peace with whatever was coming. He told her about the warrant, about the depositions, about Judge Beaumont and the land claim. He laid it out cleanly, the way he had been trained to do, giving her the facts without adornment. She listened without interrupting him, and when he was finished she was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the tabletop, and then she got up and went to a cabinet in the far corner of the kitchen, one with a small lock that she opened with a key she wore on a cord around her neck. She brought back a folded envelope and set it on the table between them. "Calvin paid $2,000 in gold coin for that land in the summer of 1877, she said. He paid it to a man named Thomas Garland, who had received it as settlement for a railroad debt from Edmund Graves. Thomas Garland signed a deed and filed it at the county recorder's office in Caldwell. I have a certified copy of that filing right here, and I have the original receipt of payment in Calvin's handwriting, witnessed and dated. I also have a letter from Thomas Garland himself, written 8 months before he died of fever in New Mexico Territory, confirming that the transaction was fully legal." Roy opened the envelope slowly. He examined the documents one by one in the morning light coming through the kitchen window. He looked at the county recorder's stamp on the deed copy, at the careful copperplate handwriting in the payment receipt, at Garland's letter with its shaky but unmistakable signature. Then he looked up at her. "These are real," he said. He was not sure why he said it aloud, except that saying it made it more concrete, made the thing he was already feeling in his chest harder to push aside. "Of course they are real," Harriet said without heat. "They have always been real. Edmund Graves simply needs enough important men to pretend otherwise." Roy put the documents back in the envelope carefully. He sat for a long moment while she poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him, and he thought about 11 years of believing that the law was a structure that protected the truth, and about the way those 4 pages in Judge Beaumont's file had never once mentioned Thomas Garland, never once acknowledged that any prior transaction had occurred. He thought about the signed depositions from men he had never met, men who had signed papers prepared by Graves's attorney and whose testimony Roy had been appointed to deliver in court 6 weeks from now. "Can I read those again?" he asked. She pushed the envelope back toward him without a word. He read them twice more slowly, and when he was finished the second time he set his coffee cup down and looked at her with the uncomfortable, itching feeling of a man whose certainty has just been dismantled by something as simple as a folded piece of paper. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask. Why did you let me in? Why did you not send me off at the gate and tell me to come back with a lawyer present?" The question seemed to surprise her, which surprised him in return, because he had the distinct impression that Harriet Holloway was not easily surprised by much. She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, with those dark, steady eyes, and then the corner of her mouth shifted in something that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "Because hiding from the truth never helped anybody," she said, "and because I could tell from the road that you were a man who actually wanted to find it." He went back to the hotel and sat at the small writing desk in his room and spread the file from Judge Beaumont across the surface and went through it again, this time with a different kind of attention. He was not reading it the way he had written down here to read it, as a collection of facts that led to a foregone conclusion, but as a structure, looking for what was missing, what had been left out deliberately. And the more he read, the more he found. 3 of the 4 depositions had been taken on the same day in Wichita by the same notary, and that notary, he realized when he read the name carefully, worked out of an office at the same address as Graves's attorney. None of them mentioned the 1877 transaction. The 4th deposition was from a man named Gerald Fick, who claimed to have witnessed Harriet Holloway forging Calvin's signature on a deed transfer. But the date on that alleged forgery was 2 months after Calvin had died, which meant that even in the testimony's own internal logic, it was not a forgery of Calvin's signature, but simply a widow administering her deceased husband's estate, which was not only legal but required. Roy poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the nightstand and stood at the window looking out at the Caldwell Main Street and the evening traffic of cattle drovers and merchants, and the women who ran the boarding houses and the dry goods stores. He was holding a file that had been constructed to take a woman's land, and he had been appointed as the instrument of that construction, and the weight of that was settling over him like the particular gray quality of a Kansas sky before a storm. He went back to see her the next morning. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, kneeling in the turned earth with a trowel and a flat of small seedlings, transplanting them into the prepared rows with the focused care of someone for whom this work was not a chore but a practice. She looked up when she heard the horse, and again she did not seem alarmed, just straightened to her feet and pulled off her work gloves and waited for him at the garden gate. "You came back," she said. "I have more questions," he said. "Then come in." Over the next 4 days, Roy Shepard returned to the Holloway property every morning, and each morning Harriet met him with the same openness that she had shown on the first day, answering his questions with a directness and a precision that he had encountered in very few witnesses, guilty or innocent, in 11 years of law work. She knew her documents. She knew the history of the transaction. She knew the names of every player in Graves's scheme and could speak to their motivations with a clarity that told him she had been thinking about this for a long time, had been preparing for this confrontation since long before Roy had appeared on the South Road. On the third day she walked him out to the land itself, the southern acreage that was the subject of the dispute, and he stood at the edge of her fields and watched the way the wind moved through the young corn she had planted. And she stood beside him and told him about Calvin, about the years they had spent building this place up from raw prairie, about the plans they had made for a proper cattle operation once the field crops were established. Calvin had died of pneumonia 2 winters ago, she told him, and the voice in which she said it was not the voice of grief still raw but of grief worked through, settled into the grain of her, changed into something quieter. He was a good man, she said. He deserved better than to have what he built stolen from his widow. Roy said nothing. He was watching the way the light moved on the corn and trying not to notice how close she was standing, how the wind had pulled a strand of dark hair loose from her hat and left it against her cheek, and how he had, without any reasonable explanation for it, become aware of her in a way that had nothing to do with the warrant in his breast pocket. On the fourth day, he brought the full file with him and laid it on her kitchen table and went through it with her point by point, and she sat across from him and listened to each piece of fabricated testimony without flinching, only asking precise questions and making careful notes in a small ledger that she kept beside her coffee cup. By the time they reached the end of the file, he was not pretending any more that he was a neutral party gathering evidence. He was a man who had spent 4 days in the company of someone whose honesty was so complete that it made the dishonesty of everything around her visible by contrast. "I need to tell you something," he said, when the file was closed and the notes were finished. She waited. "The testimony I was brought here to deliver is constructed. Every piece of it that I can verify, I have verified as false or misleading. The documents you have shown me are genuine, and they substantiate your ownership of this land completely. There is no legal case against you that can survive contact with the actual evidence." She was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you going to Wichita in 6 weeks to testify against me?" "I am not sure I am," he said. The words came out before he had fully decided they were going to, and once they were in the air between them, he felt the particular vertigo of a man who has just said something true that he cannot take back, something that has moved the world a small but irreversible distance from where it was before. He looked at her and she looked at him, and in the quiet kitchen with the coffee going cold between them and the Kansas wind picking up outside the window, something shifted between Roy Shepard and Harriet Holloway that neither of them had arrived at this table expecting to find. "That is a significant statement for a man in your position," she said carefully. "I am aware of that. It could cost you your badge. I am aware of that too." She looked down at her folded hands, then back up at him. "Why would you do that?" He thought about the honest answer to that question, which was not entirely about justice and which he was not prepared to say yet. So he gave her the one he could say. "Because I have spent 11 years trying to be a man the law is worth having. And what is in that file is not the law, it is just money wearing the law's clothes." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw something move in her expression, something careful and private that had not been there before. "Be very sure of what you are deciding," she said finally. "Graves has a long reach. Judge Beaumont has a longer one." "I know," he said. And then, because it was the thing that had been true since about the second morning and there was no further point in pretending otherwise, he added, "I would still like to keep coming back here if you will have me." The look she gave him then was the most complicated thing he had ever tried to read in another person's face, a mixture of wariness and something softer that she was keeping on a very short leash. "For what purpose?" she asked. "To help you," he said, "and if I am honest, for other reasons too." "Other reasons," she repeated, and the echo was not a question so much as an acknowledgement, and the careful softness in her expression stayed where it was, controlled but present. He went back every day after that. He began to help with the property in the mornings, which was not a thing he had planned but which began naturally on the 5th day when he arrived to find her struggling with a fence post that had been knocked over by a steer that had gotten through the neighboring pasture. He held the post while she packed the dirt around it, and they worked side by side in the early light without talking much, because the work did not require it, and because they were both people who had learned not to fill silence just for the sake of filling it. After the fence post, there was a section of barn roof that needed new shingles, and after the roof there was the irrigation channel that needed clearing before the summer heat arrived, and Roy found himself arriving each morning with the particular expectation of someone who is not yet sure what to call what he is feeling, but knows it is pulling him in a direction that has nothing to do with warrants or courtrooms. Harriet, for her part, accepted his help with a matter-of-fact grace that was not flirtatious, but was warmer than politeness. And she fed him breakfast and then lunch, and they talked, the way people who are genuinely interested in each other talk, not just about the immediate subject but around it and through it, following threads wherever they led. He learned that she had been born in St. Louis, had come west with Calvin in 1874 when she was 22, had lost a child in the first year of the journey and never spoken much about it afterward, had learned to ride and to shoot, and to read a weather sky, and to navigate a land dispute with the composure of a trained attorney. She learned that he had been born in Ohio, had come west at 17 with nothing but a horse and a stubbornness that had eventually found a productive application in law enforcement, had been engaged once to a woman in Abilene who had decided that a lawman's life was not compatible with the kind of peace she needed, and had been alone since with the kind of acceptance that was not quite contentment but had passed for it. He told her things he had not told anyone. He was not sure when he started doing it, only that at some point the conversations that had begun as information gathering became something else entirely, a kind of honest disclosure that he had not practiced in a long time. On the 9th day she asked him to stay for supper. He stayed, and they ate at the long kitchen table by lamplight, and afterward she made tea and they sat on the porch in the cooling evening and watched the stars come up over the Kansas plain, and at some point she said, without looking at him, "You are not what I expected a lawman to be." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to dismiss." He turned his head to look at her profile in the lamplight that came through the window, the straight line of her nose and the strong line of her jaw, and the way she was watching the stars with a directness that she brought to everything, as if looking away was a form of dishonesty. "I find you impossible to dismiss," he said, and did not attempt to make it sound like anything other than what it was. She turned to look at him then, and they were close on the bench, and the evening was warm, and the stars were out in their full summer density above Caldwell, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and in that moment the thing that had been building between them for 9 days was simply present, not hidden, not performed, just there. "Roy," she said, and the way she said his name with that particular quality of consideration told him that she was not making a small decision. "I know," he said. "I know what the situation is. I know what I am supposed to be doing here, and I know what I am actually doing here, and I am not confused about either one. Are you certain about what you are choosing?" "I was certain about it 5 days ago," he said. "I just did not want to say it before I was sure you were not going to throw me off the property." She laughed at that, a real laugh, unexpected and full, and it was such a contrast to her usual composure that it hit him somewhere between the chest and the stomach with a force that he was not entirely prepared for. He had not heard her laugh before, not like that, and the sound of it made him aware of how much he wanted to hear it again. "I considered it," she said when the laugh subsided. "On the 2nd day you had that look about you." "What look?" "The look of a man who is about to complicate everything. And yet you made coffee." "I always make coffee. It buys me time to decide." He smiled at that, and she smiled back, and in the warm Kansas night with the sound of the horses in the corral, and the distant music from a saloon 2 miles up the road, Roy Shepard and Harriet Holloway sat and let the world settle around the new shape of what they had become to each other. He rode back to town that night with the file pressed against his chest and a mind that was entirely made up about what he was going to do with it. He spent 2 days doing it properly, because even in the act of dismantling something corrupt, he intended to be thorough. He went through every deposition one more time and documented each specific point of falsification in his own handwriting, cross-referenced against the genuine documents Harriet had provided him with copies of. He wrote a detailed account of the discrepancies in the chain of title that Graves's claim depended on, the missing documentation of the original Garland to Holloway transaction, the impossibility of the forgery allegation given its stated date. He wrote clearly and precisely, in the language of a man who had learned to be accurate, because he wanted there to be no confusion about what he had found or why he had concluded what he had concluded. And then he wrote a letter to Judge Beaumont. The letter was not what Roy had been asked to write. He had been asked to write a confirmation of the depositions, a supporting statement for the prosecution case. What he wrote instead was a complete account of his investigation, including the genuine documents Harriet had produced, including the testimony of Deke Harmon and 2 other Caldwell citizens he had spoken to who had direct knowledge of the 1877 purchase, and including his professional opinion that the charges against Harriet Holloway were without legal foundation and appeared to have been constructed to facilitate the seizure of legitimately owned property. He sealed the letter and addressed it. He kept a copy for himself. Then he took the file, the original file with its false depositions and its fabricated chain of evidence, out behind the hotel to the small courtyard where the kitchen staff burned rubbish, and he built a fire in the iron barrel there on a quiet Thursday morning in the second week of April in the year 1882, and he burned it. He watched every page catch and curl and blacken and dissolve into ash, and he felt the weight of 11 years of unquestioning service shifting on his shoulders into something new, something that was heavier in some ways and lighter in others. He was not burning the law. He was burning a lie that had been dressed in the law's clothing, and the distinction mattered enormously to him, even as he acknowledged that the men who had sent him here would not see any distinction at all. The letter to Judge Beaumont went out on the Thursday afternoon stage. He rode out to the Holloway property that evening and told her what he had done. He told her about the letter, about its contents, about the documentation he had sent with it. He told her about the fire. He told her clearly, without softening it, what the likely consequences were for his career, because she had asked him once to be sure of what he was deciding, and he owed her the full honesty of what sure actually meant. She listened to all of it standing on the porch with the late light behind her, and when he was finished, she was quiet for a long time, long enough that he began to wonder if he had misjudged something fundamental, if the warmth between them had been something he had constructed in his own wishful mind from material that was not as solid as he had believed. Then she came down the porch steps and crossed the garden path and opened the gate and came to him where he stood beside his horse, and she took his face in both her hands, which were calloused from work and warm from the evening, and she looked at him with those steady dark eyes from a distance of about 4 inches. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I did it because it was right. You also did it for me." "Yes," he said, "both things can be true." She kissed him then, not tentatively but with the same directness she brought to everything, and he put his arms around her, and the Kansas evening went golden and still around them, and the sunflowers along the fence bent in the wind, and the whole thing was, Roy thought, about as close to a perfect moment as a man in his circumstances had any right to expect. They stood together in the gap of the gate for what felt like a long time, and when she finally pulled back and looked at him, her expression had none of the careful guardedness that it had carried for the first 2 weeks. What was there instead was something open and sure, and it made her look different, younger and more vulnerable but stronger at the same time, The way people look when they have decided to stop protecting themselves from something and simply let it be what it is. "Come in," she said. "I made chicken and rice." He came in. Judge Beaumont's response arrived 14 days later, on a Monday morning, delivered by a courier from Wichita who looked extremely unhappy about being the bearer of whatever message he was carrying. Roy accepted the envelope with the composed expression of a man who has had 2 weeks to prepare for whatever it contains, opened it at the hotel writing desk, and read it 3 times. The judge was displeased. This was conveyed in language that was technically formal but carried a heat beneath it that burned right through the official phrasing. Roy was informed that his conduct had been irregular and prejudicial to the proceedings. He was informed that Edmund Graves was an interested party with legitimate legal standing. He was informed that the documents produced by the defendant, meaning Harriet, were of uncertain provenance and would require court examination. He was informed, in the letter's final paragraph, that Roy's appointment as Sumner County Sheriff had been a matter within the governor's discretion to revisit. There was no direct mention of the Byrne depositions, which meant the judge either did not yet know they were gone or had decided not to reference them explicitly. Roy folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and walked out of the hotel and down the main street of Caldwell to the telegraph office, where he sent a wire to his friend and former colleague, a federal marshal named Amos Purdy who operated out of Dodge City and who had, over the years, developed a relationship with a federal circuit judge named Harlan T. Morse that Roy was now prepared to make use of. The wire was brief. It said that Roy had evidence of land fraud with federal implications, given that the railroad company at the center of the original transaction had received federal land grants, and asked whether Marshal Purdy and Judge Morse would be receptive to a formal complaint. The reply came the next morning. It said, "Come to Dodge with your evidence. We will listen." Roy went to Harriet that morning with the judge's letter in one hand and Purdy's reply in the other, and he laid both on the kitchen table and explained what they meant and what he intended to do about them. She read both letters carefully, then looked up at him with an expression that mixed relief and concern in equal measure. "Going to federal court is a bigger fight," she said. "A fairer one," he said. "Beaumont is in Graves's pocket. Morse is not. How do you know?" "Because Amos Purdy has known Harlan Morse for 20 years, and he would not have sent that reply if there was any question about it." She considered this for a moment, tapping her finger against the edge of Purdy's wire. "You would have to ride to Dodge. I would be back in 4 days, 5 at the outside, and while you are gone, Graves might send someone." "He might," Roy said. "That is why I want to talk to Tom Braddock before I leave." Tom Braddock was the Caldwell town marshal, a steady, weathered man of 52 who had been a fixture of the town since before the railroad came and who had, as Roy had discovered over 2 weeks of conversations in the dusty rows, a particular dislike for Edmund Graves that had its roots in a property dispute of his own some years back. Roy had spent the last week building a careful relationship with Braddock, sharing enough of what he knew to establish trust and enough of his findings to make the marshal's own position clear to him. He went to Braddock's office that afternoon and laid out the situation completely, including the Byrne depositions and the federal approach. Braddock listened with his boots on his desk and his hat over his eyes, and when Roy was finished, he pushed the hat back and looked at the ceiling. "You burned a judge's papers," Braddock said. "I burned a pack of lies that someone put in a judge's format. That is a fine distinction in a court of law." "It is the correct one," Roy said. Braddock looked at him for a long moment, then brought his boots off the desk and sat forward. "You sweet on that woman." "Yes," Roy said, because there was nothing to be gained from being indirect about it at this stage. Braddock nodded slowly as if this was information that explained a number of other things. "She is a fine woman," he said. "Calvin was a good man. That land is hers by every right that matters. I need to know you will keep an eye on the property while I am in Dodge. I will do more than that. I will put Charlie Wen on the South Road." Charlie Wen was Braddock's deputy, a young man of Chinese descent whose family had come west with the railroad and stayed when it moved on, and who had, under Braddock's mentorship, become one of the steadiest deputies in the county. Roy had liked him immediately on meeting him, recognizing in his careful competence something of himself at a similar age. "Thank you," Roy said. "Bring back something useful from Dodge," Braddock said. "Graves has been owing this town a reckoning for a long time." Roy rode to Harriet's that evening to tell her the plan. She had made coffee, and there was cornbread on the table, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of it. And for a moment he stood in the doorway and simply let the warmth and the smell and the ordinariness of the scene settle into him before he sat down and told her what he had arranged. She was quiet through most of it, and he could see her working through the pieces, assessing risk and probability the way she did everything, with a methodical precision that he had come to find enormously reassuring in a person. "How long will you be in Dodge?" she asked. 4 days, possibly 5, she nodded. Then she said with a carefulness that told him she was choosing the words specifically, "Be careful with yourself." "I intend to. I mean it, Roy." And the way she said it, with the particular emphasis that told him this was not a formality but a genuine instruction from someone for whom his return had become a matter of personal importance, made something tighten pleasantly in his chest. "I know you mean it," he said. "I will come back." He left for Dodge City the next morning at first light, riding north on the Kisham Road with his saddlebags full of documentation and his mind full of Harriet Holloway. The journey to Dodge was a day and a half of open Kansas plain, the spring grass green and wide under an enormous sky, and he made the ride quickly, pushing his horse at a good pace and stopping only when the animal needed it. Amos Purdy met him at the edge of town, which told Roy that Purdy had been watching the road. He was a tall, rangy man with a gray mustache and the particular loose-limbed ease of someone who had been good at his work for a long time and had arrived at a place where he no longer needed to prove it. He took Roy's hand with a firm grip and looked at him with the shrewd assessment that Roy had always associated with him. "You look like a man who has complicated his own life," Purdy said. "Considerably," Roy agreed. "Tell me everything." They sat in Purdy's office that evening, a plainly furnished room that smelled of tobacco and leather and old paper, and Roy told him the whole story from the beginning, from Judge Beaumont's file in Wichita to the documents in Harriet's cabinet to the fire behind the Merchant's Hotel. He told it chronologically and completely, without editorializing, and when he was finished, Purdy refilled both their cups from the coffee pot that had been sitting on the stove and said nothing for a long moment. "The railroad angle is the key," Purdy said finally. "The original land grant that Graves received was federal. If Garland transferred title to Holloway as settlement of a railroad debt, and that debt had its origin in federal land grant funds, then the property question has federal jurisdiction and Beaumont's court is not the right venue regardless of what Graves wants." "That is what I thought," Roy said. "Can Morse hear it?" "Morse will hear it. He has been looking for leverage against Beaumont for 2 years. The man has been a stain on the bench since Rutherford Hayes was president." They met with Judge Harlan T. Morse the following morning in a proper chamber at the federal courthouse, and Roy laid out his documentation on the judge's wide oak desk and walked through it methodically while the judge, a small, neat man of 60 with silver spectacles and the manner of someone who had developed his patience through many decades of being lied to, listened without expression. When Roy finished, Morse picked up the Garland letter and read it twice, then looked at Roy over the spectacles. "You burned the county-level depositions," Morse said. "I did. That was irregular." "Yes, sir." "It was also, based on what you have shown me, entirely defensible on the grounds that the documents were fraudulent, and their destruction prevented them from being used in a proceeding that would have resulted in a miscarriage of justice." Morse set the letter down. "I will issue an order of jurisdiction transfer. The Holloway land question will be heard in this court." I will also be sending a notice to Judge Beaumont informing him that the matter is no longer within his purview and asking him to explain his handling of the original complaint." Roy exhaled slowly. "Thank you, sir." "Do not thank me yet. Graves will appeal the jurisdiction question, and it will take time to work through. But the county court no longer has the authority to issue any order against the Holloway property, and I will put that in writing today." Roy was back on the Kisham Road by noon, riding south with a copy of Morse's jurisdiction order in his saddlebag, and the particular sensation of a man who has navigated a very difficult passage and can now see slightly clearer water ahead. He pushed hard and made Caldwell in a day and a half, arriving late on the second evening with his horse lathered and the moon high over the Kansas plain. He went to the hotel, saw to the horse, slept, and was up before dawn. He rode the south road in the early morning light, and the sunflowers were there along the fence, still in their green and growing state, still weeks from blooming, and the sight of them made something in him loosen that he had not known was tight. He tied his horse at the post, and the brindle dog came off the porch and sat down and wagged its tail, and the kitchen light was on through the window. She must have heard the horse because the front door opened before he reached the porch steps, and there she was in the early light, still in her night robe with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, which he had never seen before, and she stood at the top of the steps and looked at him with an expression that he could only describe as relief made visible. "You came back," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear what was underneath it. "I told you I would," he said. She came down the steps, and he was already at the bottom of them, and she walked straight into his arms without any hesitation at all, and he held her there in the early morning, her head against his shoulder and her hands gripping the front of his coat, and the Kansas dawn came up golden and enormous around them, and the horses shifted in the corral, and a mockingbird started up somewhere in the cottonwood by the creek. He told her about Morse's order while she made coffee, standing at the stove with her hair still loose and the robe replaced by her work dress, her hands moving efficiently over the familiar tasks while he sat at the table and gave her everything, every detail of what Purdy had said and what Morse had decided and what would happen next. She listened with her back partially to him, asking questions at the right moments, and when he finished she turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "The property is safe," she said. It was not a question so much as the careful testing of a fact that she did not yet entirely trust. "The county court cannot touch it. Graves will fight the jurisdiction question in federal court, and that will take months, but Morse is not Beaumont and the documentation you have is solid. You will win." She pressed her hands flat against the counter behind her and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and he saw her take one very deliberate breath, and then she looked back at him and she was smiling, really smiling, the full unguarded version, and it was so brilliant that he felt it like something physical. "You did this," she said. "We did this," he said. "You had the documents, you opened the gate, you made the coffee." She laughed, and he laughed too, and the kitchen was full of morning light and coffee smell, and the particular warmth of two people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side. Over the following weeks, as Caldwell moved into its early summer, the situation with Graves began to clarify through the legal channels that Morse had opened. Graves filed his objection to the jurisdiction transfer, as expected, and his attorney was formidable, a man named Whitmore who had managed to keep several of Graves's questionable acquisitions legally insulated over the years. But the documentation Roy had assembled, combined with the Garland letter and the original county recorder's filing, created a factual record that Whitmore could not effectively challenge, because the challenge would have required proving a negative, that a transaction recorded in the official county records and confirmed by the selling party in a signed letter had somehow not occurred. Judge Beaumont, for his part, sent Roy a second letter, considerably less civil than the first, and also sent a formal complaint to the Sumner County Commission regarding Roy's conduct. The commission, to their credit, took the matter under advisement and then sat on it without acting, which Roy understood to mean that they were waiting to see how the federal proceeding resolved before they decided what position to take on Roy's employment. It was not a comfortable position to be in, but it was not a fatal one. Deke Harmon, at his general store, began telling anyone who would listen about the federal proceedings, which meant that most of Caldwell knew about them within a week. The town's reaction was, on the whole, what Roy might have predicted based on his first week there. The merchants and the long-time residents who had watched Edmund Graves consolidate land and leverage for years were quietly pleased. The men who did business with Graves or owed him money were careful and watchful. The drovers on the Kishom Trail cared not at all and continued doing what they had always done, which was move cattle north and make noise in the evenings. Tom Braddock removed Charlie Wynn from the South Road, but continued to ride by the Holloway property himself on his morning rounds, a gesture that Roy recognized as a form of declaration about whose side the town marshal was on. Roy's days fell into a pattern that he was increasingly reluctant to examine too carefully for fear of disturbing it. He spent mornings at the Holloway property, helping with whatever needed doing, and as the weeks passed and the legal situation stabilized, the helping became less urgent and more chosen, a deliberate decision to be present in a place where he wanted to be. He spent afternoons either at the hotel managing correspondence related to the federal proceedings or in town, maintaining the informal relationships he had built with Braddock and Harmon and the dozen other people who had become, without any formal announcement, Roy's network of support in Caldwell. And he spent evenings on Harriet's porch, or at her kitchen table, or walking the fence line with her in the long Kansas evenings, when the light went gold and then pink, and then slowly purple, talking about everything and nothing, about the past and the future and the width of the sky, and the particular quality of the wind off the plains at dusk. They were careful with each other in the way that people are careful when they have arrived at something they want badly enough to be afraid of losing it. There was no rush in what was happening between them. It moved the way the season moved, with a steady and accumulating warmth that was all the more certain for being unhurried. One evening in late May, about 6 weeks after Roy had arrived in Caldwell, they were sitting on the porch in the last of the evening light when Harriet said, out of what seemed like nowhere but what Roy suspected had been an ongoing interior conversation, "I was very angry with Calvin for a long time. After he died, I mean." Roy waited. "Not for anything he did, just for going, for leaving me alone with all of it." She was watching the darkening field, the corn taller now, moving in the evening wind. "I worked through it eventually. But it took a long time before I stopped being angry at the situation and started being able to just be in the situation without that layer of fury over everything." "That sounds very human," he said. "I suppose it does." She was quiet for a moment. "I am telling you because I want you to understand that I have not been lonely in a way that would make me attached to the first available person who was kind to me. I am not doing that." "I know you are not," he said. "I am doing this because you are specifically and genuinely someone I want to be with," she said, with the particular precision of someone who has thought about the exact words. "I wanted to say that clearly." He turned to look at her in the evening light, this woman who met everything head-on, who had faced a corrupt judge's warrant with complete documents and fresh coffee, who had grieved her husband and fought for her land, and still managed to plant hundreds of sunflowers along her fence line just because she wanted to. "I am very glad you said it," he said, and the quietness in his voice was not from lack of feeling, but from having too much of it to express at ordinary volume. He took her hand and she let him, and they sat there in the cooling evening with the fireflies starting up in the corn and the first stars appearing, and Roy thought that it was entirely possible he had never in his life been in exactly the right place until this moment. The federal proceedings reached their formal conclusion in August of that year, 2 months after Graves filed his objection, and 3 months after Roy had arrived in Caldwell. Judge Morse's decision was clear and comprehensive, finding that the land had been legitimately purchased by Calvin Holloway in 1877, that the deed was valid and properly recorded, that the claims advanced by Edmund Graves lacked legal foundation, and that the complaint against Harriet Holloway was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Graves could not bring the same claim again. Morse also noted, in a section of the opinion that had clearly been drafted with particular care, that the original complaint appeared to have been prepared with knowledge of its factual deficiencies, and referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for a review of whether any charges were warranted against the parties who had assembled the false depositions. Roy received a copy of the decision on a Wednesday morning and rode immediately to Harriet's. She was in the barn when he arrived, brushing down one of the horses, and she looked up when he came through the barn door with the folded papers in his hand, and she must have read something in his face before he could say anything, because she set down the brush very slowly and turned to face him fully. He held out the papers. She took them with steady hands and read them there in the barn, in the slanted morning light that came through the gaps in the siding, while the horse shifted beside her, and the smell of hay and horse and summer surrounded them both. When she finished reading, she looked up, and she was not crying, because Harriet Holloway was not a woman who cried easily, but her eyes were bright in a way that he had not seen before, and she pressed the papers against her chest for a moment with both hands and looked at him. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he confirmed. She crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and he caught her and held her, and she held him back with a strength that told him exactly how much of herself she had been holding in reserve all these months, while the fight was ongoing. He pressed his face into her hair and breathed in and felt the world settle, the whole complicated, forward-lurching, burning papers world of the last 3 months settle into something that felt, for the first time in a very long while, like solid ground. They went back to the house, and she made coffee, because that was what she did, and they sat at the kitchen table and went through the decision paragraph by paragraph, the way they had gone through the original file months ago at this same table, except that this time the reading was for joy rather than for strategy. She asked precise questions about the referral to the Attorney General, and he answered them honestly, telling her that it was unlikely to result in criminal charges against Graves given the difficulty of proving intent in document preparation, but that it would be a formal mark against him and would likely prevent him from attempting similar maneuvers in the future with the same ease. "Good enough," she said. And then, setting down her coffee cup, "What will you do now?" It was the question he had been sitting with for several weeks, and he had arrived at an answer but had not been sure of the right moment to offer it. He looked at her across the table, at this woman he had come here to testify against and had ended up instead choosing, and he said, "That depends on you." She raised an eyebrow. "I resigned my county appointment last week," he said. "Formally, in writing, before the commission could act on Beaumont's complaint. I wrote to Braddock, and he has offered me the deputy's position here in Caldwell, which is not the same as sheriff but is honest work in a place where I am not starting from nothing." "You resigned," she said carefully. "I had already made my choice. It seemed important to make it official." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "And the other part," she said, "the part about depending on me." "I would like to stay in Caldwell," he said. "I would like to stay near you. I would like, if you are willing and when you are ready, to ask you something more specific than that. But I am not in a hurry and I am not going anywhere, and I wanted you to know the situation plainly." She looked at him for another long moment, and he sat with the uncertainty of it, not rushing her, not filling the silence, just being present with whatever her answer was going to be. "Roy," she said. "Yes. Ask the more specific thing now." He looked at her, at the directness in her eyes that had never wavered from the first morning he rode up to her gate, at the steadiness and the warmth and the humor and the strength of her, and he said, "Will you marry me, Harriet Holloway?" "Yes," she said, immediately and without any further deliberation, as if the deliberation had already been done some weeks ago and this was simply the formal conclusion of a decision already reached. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned hers over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat that way in the morning light for a long time, not saying very much, not needing to. They were married in October of that year, 1882, on a morning when the Kansas autumn had turned the prairie grasses gold and rust, and the cottonwoods along the creek were a blaze of yellow against the enormous blue sky. The ceremony was small, held at the Caldwell Methodist Church by a minister named Reeves who had known Calvin Holloway and who spoke about the marriage with a warmth that honored the past without diminishing the present. Tom Braddock stood as Roy's witness and Deke Harmon's wife, a formidable woman named Margaret who had immediately taken Harriet under her wing, stood as Harriet's. Charlie Wen had made a wedding gift of a carved wooden picture frame, made from cottonwood, in which he had placed a small painting of the Holloway property as seen from the South Road, with the sunflowers along the fence in full late summer bloom, golden-faced and enormous, exactly as they had been for the weeks before the frost took them. Roy hung it in the kitchen, where Harriet had indicated she wanted it, and where it would remain, slightly crooked on its nail, for many years. The reception was held in the Merchant's Hotel dining room, which Margaret Harmon had decorated with ribbon and dried flowers, and was attended by most of the people Roy had come to know in Caldwell over his months there, which was a larger number than he had expected. He stood at Harriet's side through the whole of it, and several times he caught her looking at him with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that it made the world seem genuinely simple, even knowing that it was not. Edmund Graves, as Roy had predicted, did not face criminal prosecution, though the Attorney General's review resulted in a formal public censure that damaged his standing with the railroad interests he had cultivated. Judge Beaumont was removed from the bench the following spring, in a process initiated by the territorial governor's office under pressure from the federal circuit, and replaced by a man named Walsh who was known for a tedious but genuine adherence to procedure, which was, in Roy's opinion, exactly what a judge should be known for. Roy took up his deputy's position under Braddock in November and found that the work was familiar and suited him well. He had always been better at the actual work of law enforcement, the investigation and the problem-solving, and the relationship with a community, than he had been at the political dimensions of being a county sheriff, and Caldwell was a town with enough activity on the Kishom Trail to keep a deputy fully occupied without the kind of administrative burden that had come with the county office. He was good at the work, and Braddock was an easy man to work for, fair and direct and possessed of a particular institutional knowledge of Caldwell that complemented Roy's investigative instincts well. Charlie Wen remained deputy alongside Roy, and the three of them developed an efficient working relationship that gave the town a sense of order that Roy found genuinely satisfying. He came home to the Holloway property every evening, or Harriet came to town when she had business there, and their domestic life had the quality of something both of them had built carefully from materials they had each chosen with intention. She ran the farm with the same competence she brought to everything, expanding the cattle operation in the second year and taking on a hired hand, a young man named Preston who had come up from Texas with one of the cattle drives and decided he preferred Kansas. Roy helped on weekends and in the evenings, and found in the physical work of the farm a kind of satisfaction that offset the more complicated emotional work of law enforcement in a way that made each feel more worthwhile. They argued occasionally, as two strong-willed people who said exactly what they thought were bound to do, and the arguments were always honest and never cruel, and were usually resolved by the time the coffee was made, which Roy considered a very high standard for conflict resolution. She was not an easy woman to move when she had decided something, which was exactly what he had admired about her from the beginning, and he was not a man who backed down from a position simply because maintaining it was uncomfortable, which she had told him frankly she considered one of his most important qualities, and also, on the days when his stubbornness pointed in the wrong direction, his most exasperating one. In the spring of 1884, Harriet told him over breakfast that she was pregnant. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when something hit him with a force that required a moment's adjustment, and then he looked up at her across the kitchen table, and the morning light was coming through the window, and she was watching him with that expression she had, the careful one that waited for his response before fully committing to her own, and he said, "I am going to need a larger corral." She blinked, and then she laughed, and the laugh turned into something else, into the bright-eyed, slightly overwhelmed quality of someone who has just received news that has reorganized their whole internal weather. And he got up from the table and went around to her, and she stood, and he held her with both arms, and she pressed her face against his neck, and he felt the slight tremble in her that she would not let be a sob, but that was in the same neighborhood. "Are you happy?" she asked, which she almost never asked him to confirm, because she read him too well to need to. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said, and meant it in the plainest possible way, without any qualification. Their son was born in November of 1884, in the bedroom of the house on the South Road, with Margaret Harmon in attendance and Roy in the kitchen below, doing the particular form of helpless waiting that men of his era performed, while their wives did the impossible work upstairs. The boy was named Calvin James Shepard, Calvin for Harriet's first husband whose work had made the home possible, and James for Roy's father, and the combination seemed to both of them to honor the full territory of who they were and where they had come from. The baby was serious-faced and dark-eyed like his mother, and from the first week showed signs of the same focused attention that Harriet brought to every new subject, examining each new element of the world with an intensity that made Roy privately certain he was going to be a remarkable person. He was a good baby, in the sense that he fed well and slept in reasonable blocks, and did not seem to object strenuously to being held, which Roy did often, discovering in the experience of holding his son a tenderness so complete and disorienting that it took several weeks to settle into something manageable. Caldwell continued to evolve around them, as the wild Kansas towns did in the 1880s, the cattle trade still the backbone of the economy, but gradually being joined by more settled commerce as the homesteaders moved in on the surrounding land and the permanent population grew. The Kishom Trail was still active, still bringing the same mix of noise and money and occasional trouble that it had always brought, but the character of the town was shifting, slowly becoming less transient and more rooted. Roy and Tom Braddock managed the change with the pragmatic flexibility that good law enforcement required, adapting to the shifting population without losing sight of what the town needed, which was the same thing it had always needed, a sense that the people who lived there and worked there were protected by something that operated by consistent and honest principles. It was not glamorous work, and it was not always appreciated, but Roy had stopped needing either glamour or appreciation some time around the day. He had built a fire in the barrel behind the Merchant's Hotel and watched the false testimony curl into ash. Braddock retired in the spring of 1886, citing a knee that had been giving him trouble for 3 years and which he had finally decided to stop pretending was fine. He recommended Roy as his replacement, which the town council accepted, and Roy took up the Caldwell Town Marshal's badge with the particular satisfaction of a man who has arrived somewhere by a route he did not originally plan and finds that the destination suits him better than the one he had intended. He moved his office into the Marshal's building on Main Street and made the necessary adjustments that a new administration required, keeping Charlie Wen as his deputy and adding a second deputy, a steady man named George Albright who had been ranching nearby and found he had a talent for arbitrating disagreements, which was, Roy had always believed, most of what law enforcement actually consisted of. Braddock came by the office sometimes on his slow retirement mornings, sitting in the chair across from Roy's desk with his bad knee extended and a cup of coffee in his hand, and they talked about the town and the trail and the work. And on those mornings the office smelled like it always had, tobacco and leather and old paper, and Roy felt the continuity of it, the way the work moved through people and left a mark on them and then moved on, and the way the place persisted regardless. On a morning in the summer of 1886, Harriet came into town with young Calvin on her hip and a brightness in her expression that Roy recognized, having seen it once before over a breakfast table. She stood in the doorway of his office with the son at her back and their son regarding the room with his characteristic serious attention, and she said, "I think we're going to need that larger corral after all." Roy was around the desk and across the room in about 3 steps. Their daughter was born in January of 1887, in the same room, with the same Margaret Harmon attending, and was named Eleanor Frances Shepard, Frances for Harriet's own mother who had died in St. Louis the previous year. Eleanor was, from her first hour of life, categorically different from her brother, loud where he was quiet, mobile where he was still, possessed of opinions that she communicated with impressive force despite being entirely without language. She had Roy's coloring, and Harriet said in the exhausted warmth of the day after the birth, Roy's fundamental refusal to accept a situation simply because it presented itself as inevitable. "That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said about my stubbornness," Roy told her. "Enjoy it," she said. "I may not say it again." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter in her mother's arms, and his son asleep in the small bed in the corner, and his wife with her hair loose, and her face tired and beautiful in the January light. And he thought about the spring morning 3.5 years ago, when he had ridden up to a gate on the South Road with a warrant in his pocket, and a conviction that he knew what justice looked like, and about how thoroughly and gratefully wrong he had been. He had come here to destroy something and had instead found everything. He had burned papers with the law's name on them and built something truer in their place. He had given up a title and a career trajectory, and had received in return a life so fully inhabited that it sometimes seemed like more than one person ought to reasonably be allowed to have. The sunflowers came back every summer, self-seeded now, and spreading beyond the original fence line into the field margins and the meadow beyond the barn, a spreading, unreasonable abundance of golden faces that Harriet refused to curtail on the grounds that there was no such thing as too many sunflowers in a Kansas summer. Roy agreed completely. Calvin grew into a thoughtful, deliberate child who followed his mother through the farm with focused attention, learning the names of every plant and the habits of every animal, and who shadowed Roy to the marshal's office on Saturdays and sat quietly in the corner with a book, absorbing the sounds and rhythms of the work with the same comprehensive attention he gave to everything. He was going to be, Roy thought, the kind of person who understood the world deeply and spoke about it carefully, which seemed to him an excellent kind of person to be. Eleanor grew into a force of nature, a red-cheeked, fast-running, loud-laughing child who had inherited not only Roy's coloring, but his tendency to move toward difficulty rather than away from it, which made her simultaneously delightful and exhausting and deeply, unmistakably her own person. She was, by 3 years old, already negotiating with her brother over terms and conditions with a sophistication that made her parents exchange looks over her head. Life in Caldwell continued to move with the particular rhythm of a cattle town settling toward something more permanent but not yet arrived, the drovers still coming up the Kishom in the warm months, the merchants expanding their operations, the church gaining a second service and a Sunday school. Roy's work as town marshal had the steady quality of a community that was not without conflict, but had enough coherence to manage it without catastrophe, and he found in the daily work the same satisfaction he had always found in it, the sense of being useful in a specific place for a specific reason. In the evenings he came home to the house on the South Road, where the lamps were lit and the kitchen was warm, and the smell of whatever Harriet had decided to cook that evening met him at the door. He left his badge on the hook by the door and hung his coat, and the transformation from marshal to husband and father was as complete and immediate as a door closing, not because he left the work behind entirely, because no good lawman ever entirely did, but because the home was its own territory with its own weight and claim, and he entered it fully. Harriet met him in the kitchen or on the porch or sometimes in the garden with her hands dirty and her hat pushed back on her head, and they would stand for a moment in the last of the evening light and exchange the particular shorthand of two people who have lived alongside each other long enough to have developed a private language of gesture and expression. And then they would go inside together, and the evening would begin. Sometimes, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they would sit on the porch in the warm summer dark the way they had sat on that first evening 3 years before, except that now the sitting was easy and companionable in a way that the first evening's careful electricity had not been. They talked or they were quiet, and both were comfortable, and the stars came up over the Kansas plain with their usual extraordinary abundance, and the mockingbird in the cottonwood said its piece, and the horses moved in the corral, and the night settled around them like something familiar. On one such evening in the summer after Alina's birth, Harriet said, "Do you ever regret it?" He knew what she was asking. He had been asked it in various forms by various people since the story had become known, by Braddock over coffee, by his replacement deputy, who had heard the story third hand and asked Roy directly, by a young man in the dusty rows who had clearly been there when the drovers told it as an example of what happened when a man let a woman make a fool of his judgment. "Never," he said, without any delay. "Not even the badge, the county appointment." "I have a badge," he said. "It fits better than the last one." She was quiet for a moment, and he felt her hand find his on the bench between them. "I sometimes think about what you looked like that first morning," she said. "Coming up the road, you looked so certain." "I was certain," he said, "about the wrong things." "You were also kind," she said. "Even before you decided to be on my side, you were kind. That was what I noticed first." He turned to look at her in the dark. "What made you decide to trust me?" She considered the question with her usual care. "You looked at the documents," she said. "You actually looked at them. Most men would have taken them as a courtesy and then followed the warrant regardless. You looked at them like the truth of them mattered. It did matter. I know. That was why I decided to trust you." She turned to look at him, and in the faint light from the window her expression was the full, unguarded version that he had been seeing for years now, the one she kept for private moments, for the evenings and the quiet hours when the composure was not necessary. "You were worth trusting. You are still worth trusting." "I intend to remain so," he said. "I know you do," she said, and rested her head against his shoulder. And he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the warm Kansas night with the weight of a good life between them, a life made from the rubble of one that had been constructed to be dishonest, built piece by piece with careful hands and honest materials into something that held. The years moved forward with the generosity of years that are fully inhabited. Calvin, at 6, had opinions about cattle that were more sophisticated than most grown men Roy knew. Alina, at 4, could ride with a confidence that made Margaret Harmon declare her a natural, and made Roy quietly resolve to keep a close watch on the south fence line for the next decade. Harriet expanded the cattle operation in 1888, taking on a full partnership arrangement with a neighboring rancher, and managed it with the precision that she brought to every undertaking, keeping meticulous accounts in her small ledger and making decisions that consistently proved sound. Roy's reputation as town marshal grew into a quiet regional authority, the kind that is built not from dramatic confrontations, but from the accumulated trust of people who know that when they bring a problem to the marshal's office, it will be treated honestly. He was offered the county sheriff position twice in the late 1880s and turned it down both times, because the work he was doing in Caldwell was the right work, in the right place, with the right people, and he had learned the hard way that something fitting perfectly was not a thing to discard in favor of something that merely sounded more significant. On the night before their 7th wedding anniversary, in October of 1889, Roy came home from town late, having stayed to help George Albright manage a dispute between two cattle operations that had threatened to become serious, and had instead, with some patient intermediation, resolved into a grudging handshake and an agreement to move their respective cattle. He was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has spent a long day managing other people's conflicts, and he came up the porch steps to find the lamp still lit in the kitchen and the door open to the warm fall evening. Harriet was at the kitchen table with her ledger and a cup of tea, and she looked up when he came in with the expression she always had when he came home late, not worried so much as simply marking his return, confirming the complete accounting of things. "Long day," she said. "Long but good," he said. He sat across from her and she got up and poured him a cup of tea without being asked, the way she had done 1,000 times, and set it in front of him. He took it and looked across the table at her, at the small lines that 7 years had brought to the corners of her eyes and the steadiness in her expression that had only deepened with time. "Thank you," he said. "For the tea." "For everything," he said. "For opening the gate," she smiled. "You would have found the truth eventually. Maybe, but I would not have found this." She looked at him across the table, her hands folded around her own cup, and the lamp between them cast its warm, unreliable light over the kitchen with all its familiar contents, the copper pots and the flower seams and the carved wooden frame on the wall with Charlie Wen's painting of the sunflower fence, and she said, "No, you would not have found this." She reached across the table and he met her hand with his. The same table, the same kitchen, the same hands that had faced each other across those 4 pages of lies years ago, and found their way to this, to the warm, ordinary, extraordinary particular life that was theirs. Outside, in the October dark, the prairie went on without end, the grass bent by the wind that would blow here long after all of them were memory, and the stars came up in their multitudes over the Kansas plain as they always had, as they would long after the last cattle drive, and the last warrant and the last fire built in a barrel behind a hotel on a spring morning in 1882. But inside the lamp was lit, and the tea was warm, and Roy Shepard and Harriet Holloway were exactly where they had chosen to be, having chosen it as clearly and as deliberately as anything either of them had ever done, which was, when all was said and all was settled, the only kind of life worth having.